Okay, good morning, everyone. Just going to wait for a couple of seconds. Just putting a message here. If you could please just tell us who you are, where you're from, and what you do. Good morning, and Tabi Singh, how's it? Morning, Georgie. Okay, I think numbers are looking good so far. There will be a few more that join in a second. But yeah, let's get going. So morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to today's HR Indaba Network Webinar, which today is proudly brought to you by one of our partners, erNavigator. As I mentioned, I have put a message in at the top of the chat. Please just let us know where you're from and what you do. For those who don't know me, my name is Nick Smith from CHRO South Africa. I would also like to encourage everyone during the session to ask as many questions as possible, which we'll endeavor in sort of the last 10 to 15 minutes or so at the end to answer. But please note, if we don't get around to answering your questions, I will ensure that all of them are answered, and I will send you a personalized mail with your answer in the coming week. Today's webinar, we focus on labor relations and your remote workforce, how to practice labor relations from a distance. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's guests and speakers, who will come up on screen now. There we go, there they are. So our speakers today, we have Nikita Reddy. She's a senior associate at Bowmans, and she will be touching on getting your labor relations policies and procedures ready for the mobile workforce. We'll then hand over to Gary Slom, who is the Chief Operating Officer at erNavigator, and he will be discussing how a cloud-based labor relations management solution can keep your labor relations practices compliant across a geographically scattered workforce. And then last but definitely not least, we've got Khomotso Makapane, also a partner at Bowmans, and he will be sharing some tips and tricks for conducting an online disciplinary hearing. Okay, so without further ado, let's start with Nikita. Nikita, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for taking the time to join this webinar, and thank you to CHRO for giving us this platform. As many of you know, Bowmans is one of the top 5 corporate law firms in South Africa, and we have an African footprint across various jurisdictions in Africa. In South Africa, we have a large employment and benefits team who have been working hard behind the scenes to keep our clients updated during the COVID-19 pandemic and to provide practical workplace solutions. Our team has also been working hard even before the COVID-19 pandemic to establish, define, and refine best practices in the workplace. And we've teamed up with erNavigator to provide a very useful workplace tool, but you'll get more information on that a bit later in this webinar. Our aim for today is to share with you our insights into managing labor relations remotely, which is something that many employees across the world have had to grapple with in the last few months, or for the majority of this year, actually. What we've seen is that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the world of work was already changing, although at a much slower rate than what we're experiencing right now. But there was already an increased reliance on technology in the workplace, and there was a call for flexible working arrangements from most employees throughout organizations. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, many employees have been forced to make these changes. And we think that there have been positive changes to a large extent, primarily because many employers clung to outdated policies and practices, and there really was a need to modernize workplace practices to suit the modern world of work. So this morning, we're going to be discussing a few of the key issues that seem to be common across most workplaces, and we're going to discuss how these issues can be managed. So the first issue is determining or adjusting an organization's work from home strategy. When our country moved to level 2 of the lockdown, the economy opened up significantly, and many employees would have been able to return to work, But I think it's been quite common that employers have still given some thought to whether they should continue with a work from home strategy, and are even starting to consider whether this should be something that is permanent in the workplace. And we think that this is actually a perfect opportunity for employers to assess their current business model and to take a look at whether permanent arrangements can be put in place that are more flexible and agile going forward. And we think that employers should be using this time to ask themselves the following questions. To what extent has remote working adversely affected or enhanced productivity? I think it's quite common that most employers are concerned that productivity decreases significantly if employees are not physically at their office and in their seats. But this might not always be the case. Could a mixed model work? It doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach. Could your organization have a model where employees come in for a few days a week, or whether teams alternate their presence in the office? How will performance and workplace discipline be managed? And this is something we're going to discuss in a little more detail because it's quite a big issue for employers. What are the main concerns around offering flexible or agile work arrangements, and how can these be overcome? Now, productivity is one concern, but it's not the only concern. Many employers are considering whether flexible work from home arrangements have an impact on communication, learning, and collaboration in the workplace, and that's probably a valid point to consider. And finally, how can the organization remain relevant, competitive, and profitable? We think in the current world of work and where workplaces are becoming increasingly modern, that most employees are actually looking for environments where they can work flexibly, remotely, or have agile working arrangements. So we think that this is something that employers across the board should be considering at this point in time. And that brings us to our second issue, which is monitoring employee performance. As I've said, there is largely a concern that productivity decreases if employees are allowed to work remotely, at home, or at other places in where employees can't actually see their employees working at their desks. However, this has really turned out not to be true. In most instances during the pandemic, employees have, for the large part, remained productive, and in some cases, there's actually been increased productivity. There's probably a number of reasons for this. It could range from employees just feeling better about their work-life balance and happier, being able to spend more time at home. And I think time plays a big factor here, where employees don't have to face the traffic each morning. They can actually use that time to get more work done. But the question remains is, whatever your arrangements, how can you as an employer manage the performance of employees who are working remotely? The answer depends on some extent to the nature of the business. But regardless of the nature of your organization's business, there are practical solutions that can be employed to monitor performance effectively. So technology makes it really easy. There are many technological tools that can help an employer manage performance, especially where employees are working remotely. For example, an employer can measure work done by use of a time capturing system. Most law firms, for example, use this system, and that could be quite appropriate, especially where productivity or output is determined with reference to time. Alternatively, you can also use technology to monitor whether employees are actually logged on and working, subject, of course, to privacy considerations. But even if technology is not applicable or appropriate in your organization, there are many other very simple and practical measures that you as an employer can employ in order to monitor performance. For example, the time has come to now set very clearer deliverables and timeframes for employees. This can be done over email, through remote meetings, etc. But if an employee is clear on what they have to deliver and by when, it's actually quite easy to monitor performance. Alternatively, or in addition, employers could also schedule regular catch-ups and ensure that there's consistent communication. So communication here really is key, and the answer is that there are any number of ways of monitoring performance as long as it's done regularly, consistently, and employees know what's expected of them. It's important to bear in mind, though, that your performance management and disciplinary policies need to be flexible or broad enough to cover these new ways of performance management. For example, existing policies might contemplate face-to-face performance meetings, or they may assume that performance is being managed in person at the office. And we think that we now have the perfect opportunity to assess not only the best ways of monitoring performance, but also whether or not an organization needs to adapt its policies to suit the new modern world of work. And that brings us to the third issue, which is managing workplace discipline. Now, most employers would have disciplinary policies in place, but to a large extent, those policies would be inapplicable to remote working. Most disciplinary policies assume that a hearing will be conducted in person. They generally allow for the leading of evidence and cross-examination of witnesses. They often contemplate face-to-face interviews or investigations in order to establish the relevant facts, and they may also involve a number of hearings and even a panel of decision makers that need to deliberate in person. And so these kinds of policies would have made it difficult, if not impossible, for employees to manage discipline while working remotely. And we think that disciplinary policies are a key example of where a mindset shift is actually required to modernize workplace labor relations. So interestingly here, most employers choose to adopt more complex procedures than what's actually required by law. I'm not going to go into too much detail because that's actually a topic for another day, but very briefly, the requirements for a pre-dismissal hearing and procedural fairness are set out quite clearly in the Code of Good Practice to dismissal in the LRA, and they've also clearly been explained and established in a labor court judgment called Avril Elizabeth Home for the mentally handicapped versus the CCMA and others. It's quite an old judgment. I think it was delivered in 2006. And since then, all of those principles have been confirmed and applied in a number of cases and articles over the years. But despite this very clear direction in law, for some reason, most disciplinary policies are still aligned with the criminal justice model. This normally involves multi-stage disciplinary hearings, formal rules of evidence, cross-examination, and often even the internal right of appeal, where this is not even a requirement in law. So what we find is that most disciplinary policies are overly formalistic, and that there really is a need to shift them to make them more modern and more applicable to the modern world of work. So really, disciplinary policies should be streamlined to meet the essential requirements of the LRA. And that contemplates a very simple process, which can also be quite informal. It requires an employer to conduct an investigation where necessary. Now, historically, we would have assumed that investigations need to be conducted in person, but there really is no reason why this can't happen virtually. The person investigating the alleged incident or conduct can set up virtual interviews on any platform and just have a discussion with the relevant people in order to establish the facts. Of course, the employee must be told of what the employer suspects they've done wrong, and the employer must afford the employee an opportunity to be heard. Now, commonly, this is interpreted as a requirement in law for employees to be given a hearing in person, where they are able to cross-examine witnesses, etc. But this is actually not what the law contemplates. An opportunity to be heard can involve a very formal discussion, and again, there's no reason why this can't take place by way of an online meeting on any virtual platform, or even be afforded an opportunity to make written representations regarding their suspected conduct. And the final requirement is that the employer must communicate the final decision to the employee in writing. So it's a much simpler process than what most current disciplinary policies contemplate. What's happened during the pandemic is that many employers made temporary adjustments and they streamlined their processes only for the duration of the pandemic. And we're suggesting that employers should at least consider whether more permanent changes are required to enhance efficiency and also fairness in the workplace to both sides. However, we're not suggesting that employers make unilateral changes to their policies. Employees must consider the extent to which consultation with staff is necessary before adopting any changes or any new policies. And this is particularly so where policies are incorporated into contracts of employment by reference, but that's not the only circumstance where consultation will be required. So guard against unilateral amendments, but we are suggesting that employers start to consider whether their policies are outdated and whether amendments are necessary. So the takeaway from my piece is that employers should be using this time in the pandemic to modernize their approach to labor relations and to consider the extent to which technology might make their workplace policies and processes more efficient and fair. You'll hear more on this by Gary Slom from erNavigator, but for now, that's it from me, and I'm going to hand over to Nick.
Great, thanks so much, Nikita. If you could just turn yourself on mute there, yeah, just to get rid of that reverb. Okay, so how's it, Gary? Let me get your slides up. Okay, there we go. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Nick. Great to be on this webinar today. Thank you very much for the opportunity. For those of you who may not heard, my name's Gary Slom. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at erNavigator. What I'd like to do is just give a bit of a background about what the erNavigator is. So the erNavigator is a cloud-based software solution that digitizes, automates, and standardizes all labor relations processes. Since about 2003, the software has moved companies' labor relations processes in companies in both South Africa, and we also software is used in 27 countries, and it's transformed their labor relations processes from manual paper-based to online best practice processes. So we've had 15 years experience helping some of the largest organizations in South Africa digitize their labor relations, and I'd like to share some of that experience with you today. And I'm going to extend on what Nikita was talking about. I'm going to take you through why and how you should be using technology to digitize your labor relations, especially in these times and in these new ways we found ourselves working. If you look at most HR processes today, most organizations have digitized most of them. Things like your employee data, your payroll, your recruitment, your talent management. Those tasks and those processes are carried out online. But if we look at labor relations, which arguably is one of the riskiest of all of those, it's lagged behind in terms of digitization, and you'll find that these tasks are still being carried out on paper or manually. Now, the complicating factor with labor relations is it impacts, it's conducted throughout the organization, very widespread, and it impacts on many role players throughout the organization. Your line managers, HR people, our staff, and many of them will have various knowledge and expertise, different degrees of knowledge and expertise in these labor relations issues and complex issues. So, not digitizing your labor relations does create quite a lot of risks in the business, and I'm just going to highlight a few of them. So, first of all, there's the risk that you won't be compliant with your discipline or your policies, different types of policies in your organization as well as the law. Secondly, the risk that you won't practice your labor relations consistently throughout the organization, and therefore not all employees will be treated fairly. There's the risk that you won't adhere to data privacy laws, and that becomes quite a key component, especially in today's times. The risk, and just to speak further on that point, when we have information and documentation throughout the organization on emails and paper-based files, very hard to control that data privacy side of things. There's a risk that you will not follow best practice when carrying out these processes, and that's often because it's difficult to develop internal skills in your organization and create the capacity and ensure that these processes are all standardized. And then the risk that you are not making proactive decisions in your organization, because it's not that easy to quickly extract real-time labor relations data when you need it. So now those are your normal risks you'll find. Now with COVID-19 and the lockdowns, those risks have been greatly exacerbated in organizations. I mean, as Nikita touched on, many people working from home, we won't have the full complement of employees in the office anymore. So it seems like a hybrid model of working from home together with some central meeting facility or team interaction will be the way of the future. Now, despite this, HR and our managers still have to comply with legal, with the labor relations legal requirements, policies and processes, especially across a decentralized and a scattered workforce. So the key question is, how do we ensure compliance, consistency and fairness when a large amount of our employees and certainly our and HR teams will be geographically spread, while our processes are still remain manual and are paper-based? Because a scattered workforce probably means that you're going to have a lot or none or no face-to-face interaction between your line managers, your employees, your HR personnel, which makes it difficult to work collaboratively, provide supervision and ongoing training. So more than ever, organizations need to digitize their labor relations so that all their case files and tasks are completed collaboratively online in real time. And this can only be achieved through the use of technology. So without a doubt, there is a need to move all labor relations online as soon as possible. And I think most organizations accept this fact today. But if we accept that is the way to go, the next question becomes, what type of technology provider should you be looking for? Now, firstly, you must, the technology provider must provide an innovative and secure platform. And more than ever in today's times, that platform should be on the cloud. And when we talk about cloud, what becomes very important is obviously cloud security and data protection. And I'm sure we're all aware of the risks with that. We have to make sure that that side is covered. Otherwise, it could cost the organization a lot of money down the line. What's also very important that the technology provider must have a proven verifiable track record. So they should be around for quite a number of years providing this type of solution. And what's also important is they need to have a proven labor relations knowledge. So they need to have experience in the field, which is very important. They can't just be a general technology provider. It needs to be very specific. Now, you can have all of that, but if the solution doesn't specifically cater for South African requirements or requirements of other countries where your organization may operate, it's not going to support your users and it will not be the ultimate solution. And it won't help you digitize your labor relations in the way that we believe it should be. Now, when we talk about digitizing labor relations, we use a word called GREEN. So GREEN contains 4 elements that need to be present in any technology solution that you opt for. Without these elements, we don't believe that a digitization program would be successful in your organization. So D in GREEN stands for digitization, automation and standardization. R, reporting, analytics and measurements. E, empowering organizational capability. And M, maintaining control or monitoring non-compliance. What I'm going to do now is just go into a little bit more detail of each of these so you know exactly what I'm talking about. So first and foremost, digitization. What does that really mean? So that means the technology solution must totally replace all paper-based manual processes and move to online case files. And these case files should build up with all your information, documentation, evidence, decisions, outcomes. As your case is completed online in real time through a best practice process stages. That's what we mean when we say digitization. And what that will also do for you, it will create full online stored case histories for each employee that can be easily accessible at any time while you're using the technology. What this will do for you is it will make remote working much easier. People can work collaboratively. It will avoid the risk of missing files, case information, and will also ensure the security and privacy aspect. Now, just digitizing is one thing, but you need to make sure when you do that that you adhere to ISO 27001 as well as the new ISO 27701 for data protection. It becomes very key. Second component there is automation. What do we mean by that? That's really workflow capabilities. So the technology must be able to route cases between different role players in a particular case to be able to perform their specific responsibilities. It's also quite a key component because, as you know, in these cases, different people in the organization will have different responsibilities in a case and perform different tasks. Lastly is standardization. So the technology must have access to tried and tested South African best practice processes. You must be able to standardize best practice norms. What's also quite clear, and this Nikita did touch on towards the end of her presentation, is the software must also be practical for the times. It should be able to assist you with different ways of working. If you're not going to have disciplinary inquiries, the processes should involve that, should assist you with that, and should contain all those different options. So in the end of the day, there's no point digitizing your labor relations processes if they're not optimized, streamlined, and they're not best practice. This is where the track record of your technology provider comes in, because they should have been exposed to these industry best practices. If they have been, it's definitely going to benefit your organization. What would also help a lot if the provider is endorsed by an independent entity that sets HR standards. This will give your organization a lot of peace of mind. These are quite important factors. The next component of the green bar is reporting. So what we mean, when we say reporting, what we mean is really to have access to not just basic reporting, but proper analytics, measurements in real time on demand. These capabilities are key because they help identify strengths, weaknesses, and risk areas in real time. So the technology must enable you to quickly spot and manage workplace trends so that you can adjust your strategies accordingly. There's no point just providing information for the sake of it. It must be information that you can use, which we call actionable intelligence in your organization. The next component, empowering organizational capability, is also a very key component. What does this mean? The technology must be able to deliver up-to-date labor relations knowledge and information. So what are we talking about? Things like law summaries, rules, regulations, guidance, documents, tips, online checklists that are completed, forms and letters that are generated, that are issued to employees, things like that. What's also key is that this information, documentation must be in compliance with the LRA as well as the CCMA rules, and it must be updated for changes in legislation. What this component will do is it will eliminate the need for people to search for information or seek third-party advice. And when we're talking about forms and letters, technology should contain best practice templates that are generated in the process automatically at the right times when you need them. And they should be pre-populated with case information and employee information for you to deliver to employees when you need them. What this will do is save a lot of time in preparing this type of documentation, ensure that they are consistent and standard across the organization. In order to have this component, the technology provider must be aligned with leading experts, like attorneys, who will keep the information up to date and compliant. So this component will ensure that your users are properly supported, help them make the right decisions, follow the correct procedures, complete all the required tasks while they're working through their processes in real time, and they will comply with the policies and laws. Also, all your stakeholders, irrespective of their knowledge and expertise, will be assisted now because of all the support they'll be getting, which will improve the overall labour relations capabilities in your organisation. Now, earlier I spoke about having a scattered workforce. The technology doesn't empower your users. You're not going to overcome the problems of limited face-to-face interaction, things like that. So this is a very key component to have in the technology. The last component of the dream is your monitoring of non-compliance. This is also very key. So the technology needs to be able to automatically and in real time monitor non-compliance to your policies and law. And there should be no manual intervention. It should be able to flag your users and tell them if they're not being compliant. Maybe they've got to put in reasons and things. So this will ensure that compliance is monitored very easily and simply on an ongoing basis. Having said that, though, the technology can or should provide some manual intervention. For example, it can include approval stages or review stages within a process where specialists could maybe approve things or review information before a case can continue. So that can be included as well, should be included. Real time is key here because if there are any changes in legislation or business requirements, these rules can be updated in the technology easily to ensure that you remain compliant. This compliance aspect will ensure that processes are followed, all issues are considered, valid decisions are made, and outcomes are compliant, consistent, and fair. So we believe those four components, the dream, are key, and without them, it won't be a successful digitization program. So for me, I've shared some very important aspects to consider that we have developed over many years of working with organizations which are incorporated in our technology solution, the erNavigator. But these tips should help you enhance the success of any labour relations digitization program that you may consider. Finally, what I'd like to say to you is digitization of your labour relations is not currently on your roadmap. It certainly should be. Thank you. I'll now hand over to Nick.
Great, thanks, Gary. I just want to run a poll quickly based on what you have just spoken about. So if everyone can sort of put their answer in, we'll leave it up for 30 seconds to a minute. The poll should be up now. So the poll is: how are you currently managing your labour relations process? Is it 100% paper-based? Is it post-fact capturing on current payroll system, or are you guys fully digitized? Okay, so we'll just give a couple of seconds, see those numbers coming in. Does seem to be quite a high trend on one particular answer so far. Okay, evening out. We'll give it another 10 seconds. Okay, it looks fairly even so far between two. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. Okay, so I don't know if you can see that, Gary. So from the answers coming through, 49% of you say that you are currently 100% paper-based. 39% of you are post-fact capturing on current payroll system, and only 10% of you are fully digitized. Comments on that from you, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, that's really what we expect to see. There is a lot of organizations still fully paper-based. You do get many organizations that they carry the process out manually, and then they will just capture the results on a payroll and HR system, which to us doesn't add that much value. First of all, you're not basically carrying out, you're not using the technology to actually carry out the tasks. Not going to make ensure that you are compliant. It's not going to provide you information while you're working. And also the reporting side to that is fairly limited. Obviously, some will have more than others, but it's going to provide some information. So that's not really a solution if you really want to digitize your labor relations in the way that we believe it should be done. And from a fully digitized point of view, yes, there are some systems that may provide some workflow components that people have developed on those systems to help digitize, but they're probably not going to be providing for your labor relations knowledge and information and things like that. And they may not also help on the compliance side of things. So, yeah, this is what we expect to see. So, but we're expecting a large move from the paper-based and the post-fact capturing side more towards digitization in the future.
Okay, awesome. Great. Thanks, Gary. We'll come back to you just now. Up next, we've got Khomotso. Khomotso is going to be giving us hopefully some very useful tips and tricks for doing online disciplinary hearings. So here are your slides, and Khomotso, over to you. Thank you. Khomotso, you're still on mute.
I wanted you to say that, so.
Quote 2020. There you go.
Thank you so much, and without wasting time, to greet everyone who has joined us, I'm gonna try and be quick in the discussion, and my presentation is more in the form of highlights or topics, and just to share with you some of the experiences we have had, and hopefully to try and answer some of the questions that I saw come through on the chat. I specialize in employment litigation, essentially at Bowmans. And when lockdown hit us, we were not fully prepared. And I think we had some matters which were still outstanding. And we therefore had to think on our feet in relation to what then to do. And I think what I'm going to say now is primarily based on my experience working at Bowmans. And I mention that because we at least are lucky enough to have a full IT department and other services, and it may not be the case for other law firms or other companies, but I also did some research in the process just to try and see how we can balance the scale for those who are fortunate enough to have the technology and those who are not. And if you look at the first point, pre-hearing preparations, I'm requesting for all parties written consent to run proceedings via virtual hearing and consent form. You'll be surprised, but what we found initially is that there was a lot of pushback, particularly from tribunals and from courts to have virtual hearings, despite the president clearly having said, we need to somehow get the economy going, and the businesses that can still operate working from home, they should do everything they can to do so. And despite the clear challenges that were highlighted in relation to COVID-19, some forums either chose to shut their doors completely, or simply to insist that the parties must wait until the pandemic is over. So what we had to then do is we had to think about ways in which we can position the purpose of the LRA and the advancement of technology, and importantly, the interest of the parties in matters. Because as you can imagine, had we waited and not tried to hold these hearings, there would have been massive backlogs now in different tribunals and courts. And I think what then helped as well is we then made sure that we approach different heads of courts and tribunals, or if it is a disciplinary hearing, to speak to different parties, including organized labor, HR, and so on, and have some sort of town hall, if you like, to understand the concerns and issues and challenges and so on. And some of them I'll talk to them as we go along in terms of challenges. And what that helped us to do is to get buy-in. It helps us to get buy-in. So then consent became easier. What that means is this: parties had to be willing to invest in that time to obtain buy-in and to get everyone on board to have these hearings, particularly because we didn't know what to expect or anticipate going into this. Once agreed, or once there was consent, we didn't know some of the challenges that we would then face. Naturally, when you prepare for hearings, you meet with witnesses and you prepare them, and in this instance, we had to have virtual preparation meetings, and then it goes to the document exchange. How do you make sure that, particularly for matters that require voluminous documents and so on, we had to use systems to help share these documents? Because as you can imagine, within 2 weeks, I think my inbox was already clogged, and I couldn't send or receive emails anymore. So that was an issue. And I didn't even know that internally at Bowmans, we had a platform called iManage, where we could, it works more like Dropbox. Some of you have used Dropbox before, where you can share information on a link, and you just pay for that space. It's like a cloud kind of storage. You just have to subscribe to it. So I'll come to the regulatory framework now, because we are talking less about what was and more what is to come. So during COVID, there's been changes to the regulations at any given time, and also directives from courts and CCMAs and bargaining councils and so on, relating to how hearings ought to be conducted. And what we had the benefit of is to speak to people and have people that we were in touch with regularly, who serve in the different forums where these regulations and directives are issued, so that we can understand the insights and also be ahead of the curve, so to speak. Because information is important, and it is always good when you write to different tribunals or parties to also use relevant authority at the time. In this instance, these directives and practice manuals from different courts. But importantly, to listen to the president very carefully and to the ministers in formulating the response to those people, either who are not open to the technology or to virtual hearings, or who raise legitimate concerns relating to having virtual hearings. So talking about the regulatory framework, I think there it is just the regs that have been issued, different regs, the directives from different courts. A lot of courts struggled during COVID to have hearings, because they did not have ready-made systems. So those courts like the High Court in the South Gauteng High Court had better technology, and other courts had to copy from them. There'd been a lot of meetings behind the scenes of learning, where there was knowledge sharing between the different courts and so on. And because there was no free movement at the time, some courts still struggled. But also I realized one of the biggest stumbling block was lack of willingness to try. I think some of us were so stuck on our ways, and those that worked, and therefore having to change at that rapid pace was very challenging for some people. So it was very difficult. But as I said earlier, when you then have the buy-in, it becomes easier, because when you're moving forward on the basis of consent, even if there are challenges, we always remind each other that this is something we agreed to, and it is not imposed. I mean, there have been 2 or 3 instances where the parties had to address a judge or a commissioner, as the case may be, for a ruling, and the ruling was given that the hearing should proceed remotely. And long story short, at the end of all those 3 matters, both parties were happy on how the hearing went, and I guess sometimes until you embrace something, you don't realize its benefits. Quickly talking about pros and cons of virtual hearings. So the pros are that before lockdown, I used to travel a lot, doing hearings across the country, and also having to contend with having to get witnesses there. And one of the things we struggled about is you go to an area and you're looking for a commissioner or a senior commissioner and you can't find one, or you are forced to use people that you wouldn't ordinarily choose because of mainly the nature of the matter that is in front of you. For example, if you're dealing with a sexual harassment matter or a social media matter, related matter, you need to have a commissioner who understands social media, or who understands and has some knowledge and experience in relation to sexual harassment, because it is not everyone who should preside or who could preside over those kind of niche issues. So those are some of the pros, I guess, that with virtual hearings you can get the best man for the job or the best women for the job, depending on what you prefer. But also people can work from different places. I mean, most of the hearings I did, some of the witnesses or even at times the presiding officers were outside of the country or in other provinces, and there was no issue. But some of the cons that are obviously are data issues, because if you're going to be hearing 2 days, 3 days, 1 day, you're talking about data. But I'm going to just pause here and say something that I found very interesting. At work at Bowmans, recently we had what we call vacation work, or selection day rather. It's a 2-day process where we do interviews for university students, and we had to use different rooms, and we did it virtually. And one of the things we did was we provided them with data packages. I mean, those who did not have laptops, we had to hire laptops for them. And this is what we have done also for some of our clients. We in the process of getting the buy-in initially, the process I indicated initially, some of the things that we pick up on are if the employee has a laptop or not, if the employee has data issues or not, connectivity. We also try and speak to the local municipality to understand the load shedding schedules and so on. And of course, some of the things you can't anticipate. But what we try and do is when we hire a laptop, we make sure that it has got 3G or 4G connectivity. So in that way, it takes out the excuses that we normally see. But also employers know their employees, and we know what kind of, I guess, tools they have. But to avoid not having a hearing and to avoid things lingering, particularly when you don't know how long for, we had established relationships with companies that provide us with these tools. And of course, there are risks. 2 of them had been lost, and these things are insured, all those kind of things that we didn't know before. And certainly, I don't own a Mac personally. And since I heard about this renting thing, I rented a Mac for a month just so that I can also show it off to some of my friends. Anyway, don't tell anyone that. So those are some of the cons. So one of them is, if you're going to have a virtual hearing, you need to budget more time. Budget more time because sometimes connectivity is an issue. Budget more time because if for example, you have 4 or 5 people in the room, in the virtual room, technology might work for 4, but not for the 1. And therefore, those kind of things take time out of the process and out of the hearing. But as we budget more time, one of the pros is I've seen people being more willing to start early and to finish late, simply because they don't have to contend with traffic and other I guess obstructions. So it is a balancing act, and I think if you consider the fact that I didn't have to travel for most of the hearings to go for witness consultations or to go to the hearing in different provinces, sometimes out of the country, that is a saving to the client. And instead of seeing that money is going back to a balance sheet, then it is money that you can put back in making sure that you stock up on data or on laptops that you can give out for the specific reasons, but also on the days. If a physical hearing would have taken 3 days and a virtual hearing takes 4, that is where the money would go. So to my mind, it balances itself off, but I still think you save a lot of money and time out of the process. But also you have situations where it is very difficult. I mean, one of the witnesses that we had, for example, had a baby a month before, but was still able to connect virtually. If we had a physical hearing, there was no way that person was going to come. Some people were on holiday and so on. So they could connect. And this is the advantage. And you may be pleased to know that our courts are now going to this process. There are some cases naturally that will be dealt with virtually, particularly postponements and so on. There is no need to go to court for this kind of things. And the one thing, however, that we all need to be mindful of as we embrace technology is to try and find ways as well within the same move to create employment, because the more we automate and the more we move to these virtual hearings, there are a lot of industries that are going to suffer. And I think we have an equal responsibility, all of us, to try and find other creative ways to have people employed, or if they're not employed, that they've got startup companies that can help with technology and so on. So I think that's a topic for another day. What we can improve from past experiences and conclusion. So essentially, we were forced to go virtual in terms of hearings and so on, meetings and stuff. And I think a lot of employers and a lot of courts and a lot of companies and tribunals have realized just how outdated their systems were, but also how effective technology can be used properly. But also this just highlighted one of the major problems in our country, which is ESCOM and load shedding, but importantly, the societal inequality, because depending on where you are, either as an organization or as an employee, you've got different challenges. For example, as Bowmans, when we locked down, I think for as long as we went to the office, we were not always mindful of the fact that some of the people who were there come from locations and so on, and some of the struggles they would have. And therefore, we needed to set them up to make sure that they're connected, because they didn't really have Wi-Fi, or even if they wanted to be set up, they can't connect to a Wi-Fi because there are no running cables and so on. So we had to work very hard to try and make sure that they're set up. And these are some of the things which I think we can't ignore anymore. We need to understand and realize that the people who come to our offices belong to a society. And when they come to us, they remain an extension and a reflection of that society. And we need to be willing to get involved and to get engaged in those issues. I see Nick is back on screen. It means my time is up. I'd said to him he must kick me under the table, but he didn't. So because we are connected virtually. So I think I'll leave it there. And thank you so much for the opportunity as well to speak.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Khomotso. Some really interesting stuff and some great questions coming through. I just want to go back to this slide, and I'll just ask if Nikita can come back on camera as well. Awesome, cool, thanks Nikita. We've got a few minutes just for some questions. The first one I just want to address to Gary quickly, something I was thinking about, which is, can I use my current HR system to digitize my labor relations? So it has a labor relations component and it has generic workflow capabilities. So can this be done?
Thanks, Nick. No, it's an interesting question. Can you hear me? Look, it's an interesting question. So, yeah, it's similar to what we spoke about in the poll. So they won't provide, that type of system won't provide all the components that I spoke about. So it's going to provide some solution, but not the ultimate solution. It doesn't have the compliance aspect. You won't be working online paths. You won't get the labor relations information and knowledge. Because it's not a specific labor relations system. It's really adapted, and it's probably got a small component. But I'd just like to touch, if I can, on one question that I saw someone asked about integration to an existing system that they may have. And I just want to say that The technology should be able to do that. Through APIs, it should pass employee information between your labor relation technology and the client's own technology, so that things like employee information is kept in sync. So we didn't really touch on that, but the technology should provide that, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Then Khomotso, we have a question from Eric Osmond. He says, "Hi Khomotso, I agree with the consent forms, but how does one proceed if one or more party does not consent?"
Thank you. Very simply, if one of the parties don't agree, then you get the court, the judge or the commissioner to make a ruling in chambers. So that is what we have done. We try and get the consent in early, and if one of the parties doesn't agree, then you ask for the court to make a ruling. But I think what I was speaking about earlier was not so much about the consent forms that the CCMA and the commissioners, or rather the courts give, but rather even before you go to talk about the forms, to try and get buy-in from the parties involved, meaning try to sell to them the idea of having these virtual hearings, the pros and cons, but importantly, at the center of it, using the Labor Relations Act that says this kind of issues must be dealt with swiftly as a basis, so that by the time you approach the court, if there is no consent, at least there is that spade work or that work that had been done before in good faith.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Go on here for Nikita from Koos van der Merwe. He says, "How will injuries on duty be dealt with when employees are working from home? Will the employer indemnify itself in respect of such eventuality? As with such diverse working environments, there can be no standardization and control to provide a safe working environment to employers."
Good question, and quite a difficult one, and one that there's probably a lot of room for development in the law. But generally, the employer has a duty to create a safe working environment under OHSA, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. But I think most of us accept that an employer has little to no control over external working environments, such as the home base or other spaces where employees may now choose to work. So yeah, I think at the moment, there isn't really any legislative guidelines on this, other than to say that it applies in the normal working environment where an employer has that duty. But I think that's definitely a space where we might see some legislative interventions coming through, especially as the world of work is changing so rapidly. So yeah, there isn't really a straight answer at the moment, other than to say that for now, and most employers can accept that their duty to create a safe working environment currently extends only to the actual workplace.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. There's so many coming through, so we will address those after the session. Just one last one for Gary from Corinne Straden, asking what cloud security should be in place for these digitized systems.
Okay, well, that's a question for someone with more technical knowledge than me, but I can answer the question. Just give you some information. So it needs to have the normal securities in place. So I can tell you our technology is hosted on Microsoft Azure, which provides all the protection that you would need. So we're talking about your normal firewalls, we're talking about data encryption, database encryption. There's lots of things you can put in place, but if it's a proper technology, it will be hosted in a place where all these security and protections are in place. But if we need, we can provide more information on that question if need be when we send through all the answers.
Okay, cool, fantastic. Thanks, Gary. Okay, guys, look, we have reached the end of the webinar. I would just like to thank everyone for their time today. Just the final thing is our next session, which is the return to the workplace and how to equip your people for the realities of COVID. This is being hosted by Michelle Chetty from Unilever, Rachel Masuku from Weber Wenzel, and Richard Doherty, Senior Director of EMA at Workday. That is actually tomorrow afternoon. So if you'd like to register for that, please go to the chro.co.za/events page and register for that. Obviously, as you know, we've got these on a weekly basis. So again, yeah, thanks for everyone for joining us today. Thanks to Gary, thanks to Nikita, and thanks to Khomotso. And we will see you guys hopefully tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.